Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Medieval Podcast. And today we are joined by someone you may recognise because this person needs no introduction because they are our first guest to be on twice. So this person has written many other books before, but joins us today with this superb book called Women of the Anarchy. They also have various blogs, podcasts. They spread themselves so widely, it's absolutely incredible. So without further ado, please can I welcome Sharon Bennett Connolly.
Thank you, Luke. Lovely to be here.
No worries. Thank
Such a
you
glowing
once
introduction.
again. Thank you once again for coming on. Now, interestingly, as we were just saying beforehand, it's been about a year since you last came on, and I'm intrigued to know, just quickly before we get into the questions, you were 6 episodes into a podcast last time we spoke. How has it been going?
We've recorded over 40 now. I think we're on about episode number 43 having recorded. So we've got another one coming out tomorrow. It's been fun. It's been a lot of fun. You know yourself how it really is just enjoyable talking to other authors, or Derek and I just doing the one tomorrow is an investigative episode into the events surrounding the usurpation of Henry IV. And neither Derek nor myself knew much about it, so we had to go away and research and discuss, and it was a really enjoyable episode. And I think we both decided we still need to learn more about it, but it was enlightening.
Oh, fantastic! It's when I had a listen and everything, and it makes me really want a co-host or something, because it's brilliant to kind of have someone to go off and have these brilliant conversations with.
It is. I don't know how you do it on your own, because it's a lot of hard work. Derek does the editing because I wouldn't have a clue where to start. So I do all the questions for guests and the briefs for when we do our own, just the two of us. We have a list of questions as a guideline to keep us on track. Otherwise, we can go off on a tangent.
No, tell me about it. Well, on that tangent, we best get back to the main reason you are here, which is your book, which is, as I said before, a fantastic book about a really important period of history that is one that I would say is somewhat overlooked. What drew you to the subject of the anarchy?
It's the only period that I know of in history where two of the leading protagonists on both sides are women and cousins. You know how they suddenly started calling the Wars of the Roses the Cousins' War? Well, if they were going to call it the Cousins' War, it should be the Distant Cousins' War, because they weren't first cousins. Whereas with the anarchy, everybody was a first cousin. King Stephen was the first cousin of Empress Matilda. Matilda of Boulogne, Stephen's wife, was also a first cousin of Empress Matilda. Empress Matilda's leading general, Robert of Gloucester, was her illegitimate half-brother, and therefore a first cousin of King Stephen. So it was very much a family feud. But like you say, it is very overlooked in history, and yet it's such a fascinating period. I mean, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle felt it was severe enough to make that famous statement where they said fields were left untold. I haven't got it on me right this minute, have I? No, I haven't. So I'm going to try and remember.
It's all right. Go for it.
Fields were left uncared for, and it was a period when Christ and his saints slept. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle thought God had abandoned England because it was such a bad time, and yet there's very little study on it.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's because of where it is in history. It's sandwiched between the Norman conquest and the advent of the Plantagenets. I mean, to be fair, the Plantagenets wouldn't have arrived if it wasn't for the anarchy. Well, when you've got Henry II and Richard the Lionheart and King John on one side, and William the Conqueror and Henry I on the other, you've got to compete. And it's only 19 years. But honestly, I don't know why it is so overlooked, because it is such a fascinating period. So much goes on in those 19 years. And we did have Empress Matilda being the first woman to be proclaimed ruler of England. She was proclaimed Lady of the English. She wasn't given the title Queen, but she was proclaimed Lady of the English. She was the ruler. And even that gets overlooked, because she wasn't crowned. That's it. She wasn't queen, but
Yeah.
she was effective ruler of England in 1141.
No, definitely. It is such an important period. I guess for those who aren't aware, I mean, it's very difficult to be able to condense such a tumultuous period. But could you summarize just the chronology of events that kind of roughly happens?
Right. Well, it starts in 1120 with the sinking of the White Ship. On that ship is the only legitimate son and heir of Henry I. And when he dies, there is a succession crisis. It wasn't the cause of the anarchy, but it was the catalyst. If that hadn't happened, everything would have gone smoothly. William the Atheling would have been King of England and nobody would have been any the wiser. But because William died, Henry suddenly had no heir. His daughter, Empress Matilda, was in Germany, expecting to spend her life in Germany with her husband, the Holy Roman Emperor. Luckily for Henry, I suppose, he dies, the Emperor dies in 1125, and he recalls Matilda to England and recognises her as his heir. And then marries her to Geoffrey of Anjou, who she can't stand. He's 14 at the time, and she's about 24, 25. And you can imagine this grown woman being married to a teenage boy. She wasn't impressed. And it took her and Geoffrey a little while to actually get a hang of being married. She left him for a while and was forced to go back to him, things like that. But Henry had recognised her as his heir. The problem is, before 1125, when Matilda was still in Germany, Henry's sister Adela had sent one of her younger sons to Henry to be educated and trained as a knight. This was Stephen of Blois. And Henry must have thought between 1120 and 1125, actually, Stephen is a candidate. If I can't, Henry had remarried, so he was hoping to have a child of his own. But he must have thought, if I can't have a son of my own inherit, I could make Stephen my heir. And he marries Stephen to an heiress, Matilda of Boulogne, so that he's got plenty of money. And Matilda of Boulogne also has royal Anglo-Saxon blood in her.
Right.
So he gives Stephen this very prestigious wife. And he's grooming him for the throne. He gives him lands, he trains him. But then when Empress Matilda comes back in 1125, I think Stephen might have had his nose put out of joint a little bit, because suddenly Henry's like, no, if I marry Matilda to Geoffrey, she can have a son and my own blood can succeed to the throne. The problem is, Henry dies in 1135. Empress Matilda's son, Henry of Anjou, who would later be Henry II, is only 2 or 3 years old. And Stephen steals I can't remember what the term is now. Steals a move on Empress Matilda.
Yeah.
I think he was probably waiting in Boulogne to hear news of Henry I's death. He was ready. When Henry died, he didn't waste any time in Normandy. He hopped on a boat. Luckily, his wife's Matilda of Boulogne. He's got plenty of boats to hop onto. He hops onto a boat, gets to England, gets to London. Henry I dies on December the 1st. By the 22nd of December, Stephen's in Westminster Abbey being crowned. And as Henry's body is being brought back to England, some of the barons who are accompanying Henry are also establishing Stephen's authority in Normandy. William de Warenne, the Earl of Surrey, he establishes himself in Rouen and takes control of Normandy in Stephen's name, which really suggests that Stephen had been planning this for quite some time.
Right.
Unfortunately, at the same time, Empress Matilda was in Anjou with her husband and her young sons. The year before, she'd had a young Geoffrey, her second son, and nearly died in giving birth to him. And she'd also just discovered she was pregnant again. So she didn't have the chance to all my words mixed up today. She didn't have the chance to oppose Stephen right at that moment. So for a little while, Stephen must have thought himself really safe. He must have thought, that's it, I've got the crown. And every baron except one swore fealty to Stephen. So even Empress Matilda's half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, swore fealty to Stephen. Problem was then Stephen didn't fulfil all his promises. And by 1138, Robert of Gloucester's thinking he's backed the wrong horse and decides to hop over to Anjou to Empress Matilda and say, actually, sis, I think you should be queen. And that's what starts the anarchy. Matilda starts planning and gets to England in 1139, and the war is on.
Oh, fantastic! It's such an amazing. I always find succession crises is really interesting. And what was the kind of lasting impacts then, the consequences of the anarchy on England?
I don't think, other than the fact that we ended up with the Plantagenets for 300 years, the lasting legacy, there isn't a lot. You can't see it in the land very much now. There were some things that took a few years to resolve. Like one of the main things Henry II did when he came to the throne was order the demolition of castles that had been built without approval. And they were up and down the country where barons had built castles to defend themselves because of the anarchy. It is from the period of the anarchy that our monarchy now is descended from Henry of Huntingdon, Prince Henry of Scotland, and Ada de Warenne, who was a sister of the Earl of Surrey. Because in 1138, the Scots had decided to take advantage of the unrest in England and invade from the north, because every time England had a bit of unrest, the Scots decide to, invade and try and push their luck. Unfortunately, they pushed their luck too far and were defeated at the Battle of the Standard at Northallerton. But part of the peace treaty, the Treaty of Durham the following year, included a marriage between King David of Scots' only surviving son Henry and Ada de Warenne, she was the sister of the Earl of Surrey and the Earls of Leicester and the Count of Malone, because they were a rather extended family, the Warrens and the Beaumonts, thanks to a marriage between Isabel de Vermandois and William de Warenne. It was a very big family and a very powerful family. And through them, the monarchy still on the throne is descended directly from them.
Wow. Oh, that's absolutely fantastic. So obviously your book is Women of the Anarchy. And so what's interesting there is about how there was this decision that Empress Matilda was a viable option to be queen, and it's something that I think contradicts a bit of the mainstream thinking that this idea that there's this concept that women in the Middle Ages were passive or couldn't exercise power, but here we have an instance where actually these barons who were men turned towards this female ruler and said, actually, we want you to have the throne. Kind of what were the lives of these women actually like, and what is the significance of researching women in this way?
Well, I think the significance with Empress Matilda is that it wasn't just that some of the barons decided that yes, she could rule. It was the fact that Empress Matilda herself knew she could rule. The whole reason that she fought for the throne was she could do this. And she knew how to do it. She had been trained to be an empress.
Yeah.
She'd been regent in Germany when her husband was away at war. She'd issued charters. She'd made agreements. She'd negotiated peace between barons and things. She could do this. She knew what to do and how to do it. So I think that's the main thing that people overlook when they're looking at Empress Matilda and the anarchy. They don't realise how she claimed the throne and she was haughty and she upset all the barons, and it's like she was haughty because she was acting like a queen. She was acting exactly the way her father would have done, and no one would call Henry I haughty. They would say he got the respect he deserved, and so should Empress Matilda. And it's women in those days, yes, a lot of their authority had to be subtle. They couldn't just be outright authoritarian like Empress Matilda was, because the barons would balk at it. They had to be clever, and I think Empress Matilda was a little too forthright and upfront for most barons in her day. Yeah. She did ruffle feathers, shall we say.
No, it's interesting you say that. It's something that I found pop up, especially in sources that talk about women who do kind of have a degree of power that if they do start to I don't want to say like get too big for their boots in that, but
Yeah,
in that sense, suddenly the source kind of switches, and rather than hailing them as this kind of powerful woman, suddenly they're actually quite dangerous.
yes.
And it seems to be that kind of Empress Matilda has to kind of balance that point.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. When you look at women in history, any woman who tries to exercise power in her own right, she's a she-wolf.
Mm,
And that's not a compliment. They're
yeah,
trying to say that she's overstepping herself. And it's like, it's very hard to read it as a woman now and see what challenges they had to face.
mm,
And see, it's not just the challenges they had to face, but it's how they were written down. It's how they were portrayed, because that wasn't them. They were just being strong women.
yeah,
No, they were being haughty, or they were
mm,
they were overreaching themselves, or they were being stroppy, or it's like,
yeah,
it's really hard. And it's like, no, they were being strong and
yeah.
powerful. And those kind of descriptions for kings is fine, but for a woman, it's not.
No, definitely. It's yeah, totally right. And it's interesting. So obviously we see it in the sources. Is there an example of where Empress Matilda or Queen Matilda um, had a sort of had an encounter and was challenged because of their gender and was able to overcome it or not able to overcome it?
Well, I think the whole anarchy is Empress Matilda being challenged because of her gender.
Right.
And Queen Matilda of Boulogne is held up as the paragon of how a woman should behave,
Mm,
whereas Empress Matilda is how a woman shouldn't behave. Empress Matilda was looking for the crown for herself, so she wanted to be queen, whereas Queen Matilda was trying to recover her husband after he'd been captured, make
yeah.
sure the crown went to her son after her husband, guaranteeing the boy's inheritance.
Mm,
And there's this great incident. In February 1141, King Stephen is captured at the Battle of Lincoln. Suddenly, Empress Matilda is proclaimed Lady of the English, and she's in charge, and she's just waiting for her coronation. And Matilda of Boulogne writes, first of all, to the Church Council ordering Stephen's release. When that doesn't work, she writes to the Empress offering to take Stephen abroad or for him to join a monastery.
mm,
And she asks that the Empress guarantees their son Eustace inherits Matilda and Stephen's hereditary lands.
yeah.
And Empress Matilda doesn't guarantee this. And so the barons are up in arms because suddenly everyone's inheritance is in danger. If she won't allow the lands to pass from father to son, then she could do that for everyone.
Mm,
And the irony is that is exactly what Stephen and all those barons had done to
yeah.
Empress Matilda when they allowed Stephen to take the throne, because they had denied Matilda's son Henry
Mm,
gaining his inheritance, which was England and Normandy.
yeah.
But they don't see the hypocrisy in the fact, oh, you won't let Eustace inherit lands that his dad's not even dead yet.
Mm.
But your Henry couldn't inherit the lands because you're a woman.
Oh God. That's crazy. That is. So it makes me. It makes me wonder. So obviously, as you say, she does things that are very similar to her male counterparts. But how does, I guess, Empress Matilda and Queen Matilda differ in how they use their female power in
Mm.
terms of ancestry, bloodlines, familial relationships, personal connections, things, because obviously they couldn't wield a sword, so they use these other ways. But how did they differ in that?
Well, in using the other ways, I don't think they differ very much. Matilda of
Okay.
Boulogne, when Stephen's captured, she calls on a relative of hers, William of Ypres,
Mm,
who's a mercenary, to lead the army in her and Stephen's name
yeah.
against Empress Matilda. Now, Empress Matilda can't wield a sword, like you say, so her army is led by her half brother, Robert of Gloucester. So each of them uses generals, but they're both firmly in charge of the armies. And the year 1141, which was a discovery I made while I was writing the book, is known as the War of the Two Matildas.
Ah.
Because it's the first and only time that I can find in English history, perhaps in European history, where the opposing armies, are led by a woman.
Yeah.
And cousins as well. But what I find interesting, you read the Gesta Stephani, the Deeds of Stephen, which is the chronicle very much in Stephen's favour, praises Matilda of Boulogne, praises King Stephen as a wonderful king. Don't know where they were looking. But it refuses to call Empress Matilda Empress. It always refers to her as the Countess of Anjou.
Ah.
And tries to put her down every single time. Because she's married to Geoffrey of Anjou, who's Count of Anjou,
Yeah.
then she's Countess of Anjou. But she's a Dowager Empress.
Yeah.
And that's her title. You know, she is Matilda, Dowager Empress and Countess of Anjou. But they always refer to her as Countess of Anjou. Put her down.
Gosh, it's insane. It is. It's insane when you look back on how it was. But I have to ask, with all of that in mind and everything, who would you have wanted to see on the throne? What outcome would you have wanted, or seen as the best one, perhaps?
Empress Matilda.
Yeah.
I think she should have got the throne. I think Stephen should have stood by his oath in the first place, because he did twice swear an oath to support her claim to the throne. So he was an oath breaker anyway.
Yeah.
So he shouldn't have been on the throne. He was a liar. And he wasn't exactly, he sounds like he was a very nice man, but he wasn't a great king, you know. And I think his backbone was actually his wife, Matilda of Boulogne.
Yeah.
And it's only when after Matilda of Boulogne dies, the peace agreement is made between Stephen and Empress Matilda's son Henry, and the war ends. While Matilda of Boulogne is alive, the war's still going.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a difficult one, isn't it? But I do have a question, which is that obviously with them both being called Matilda, did you have any fears of writing a whole narrative where these two great characters have the same name? You know, say, oh, Matilda to this Matilda, and then Matilda, you know.
I think I was lucky in that I had read Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall. And in that, there's something like 5 Thomases, and I could never work out which Thomas she was talking about.
Yeah.
So I think I already had that in mind, so that when I wrote Women of the Anarchy, I'm hoping that I made clear all the time which Matilda I was talking about. So it was either Matilda of Boulogne or Queen Matilda, and Empress Matilda or the Empress. So I always tried to make sure, but there's actually 12 Matildas in the index.
Oh my God.
Because of course, the Empress Matilda's mother was Matilda of Scotland. Her grandmother was Matilda of Flanders. And there were daughters called Matilda as well. And Robert of Gloucester's daughter was called Matilda. And there was a couple of Matildas who drowned on the White Ship as well. So there was Matildas everywhere.
Yeah. Oh, I don't envy you for that, but I will say you are able to do it artfully and successfully. But so going kind of looking at the book in its wider sense, what do you hope that readers will take away from a book such as this in terms of, you know, looking at the significance of women's contributions to medieval history?
I think the main thing is that I want people to see that women were there. Because a lot of the time, there was an argument on Facebook the other day in a Facebook group.
I did see it, actually.
That women, yes, they were there, but they didn't do anything. And women's history doesn't need to be done separately, because history covers women. And it's like, yeah, if you look at history, actually, it is very much biased towards the acts of men. And it's just like, I want the women to go back into the narrative. And I think I put that in the introduction, that it's not about telling women's history as a separate subject, but it's about putting their stories back into the wider historical narrative and giving them 50% of the story. You know, they were 50% of the population, and yet they'll get about 10% of acknowledgement, and most of them don't even get acknowledged at all. And it's just, I want girls in the future to see that women did achieve remarkable things throughout history. It's not that they didn't do it, it's just that they weren't acknowledged for it.
Yeah, no, it's crazy because like in the book that I'm currently writing now about medieval women, one of my big focuses is on Adela of Blois.
Mm,
And again, such a formidable woman, but hardly anyone knows of her.
yeah.
And it's such a shame that there's so many characters in history who are women that are incredible yet
Mm.
so just
She's
overshadowed.
a prime example as well about how she is perceived.
Mm,
You know, her husband, Stephen, King Stephen's dad, goes off on crusade, fails to fulfill his vows, basically runs away from a siege and
yeah.
comes home. Apparently, he's told off by his wife, Adela, who says, "Look, you haven't fulfilled your crusade." And
Yeah.
he's forced to go back to the Holy Land where he dies.
Mm,
So Adela gets blamed for his death.
yeah.
And it's like, she probably didn't. She was probably petrified for his eternal soul because
Mm,
he hadn't fulfilled his Crusader vow. And he was also seen as a coward. He had to recover his honour. But
mm,
because she is said to have persuaded him to go back, it's like, oh, she sent him back.
mm.
Yeah, because a grown man can't decide for himself, can he?
No, it's definitely
If
it's
he'd gone back and made and become a hero,
yeah.
it would have been, oh, he was so brave to go back. But no, because he died there, it's like Adela sent him to his death.
Yeah, no, it's something really interesting, and I see that actually um in the life of Louis the Fat by Abbot Suchet, who has a big conflict, obviously, with Adela and her son, but never really talks about it. You know, Adela pulling the strings. It's
Mm,
always Count Theobald.
yeah.
You know, we met him on the battlefield. He did this and he did that, but actually, when you look at it in that kind of non-biased sense, she was actually pulling most of those strings, but she's
Mm,
just not mentioned.
no. And she and Theobald acted together, you
Mm,
know, when her regency finished. She was still a really important part, right up until she joined the convent.
yeah, and what I find really
And
interesting about Adela, which I wonder if either of the Matildas did, was she was very had a very close relationship with the church, which really I
yeah,
think helped her perception because obviously most of our sources are from the church,
mm,
written by monks and all sorts, and so one of the things that we see with Adela of Blois is how holy she is, how she supports the church, she founds monastic communities, all this other stuff. Is that something that we see Empress Matilda and Queen
yeah,
Matilda do?
definitely. I mean, Adela, she was great friends with Archbishop Anselm,
Mm,
Archbishop of Canterbury, and she was the one who negotiated the entente between Henry I and Anselm. And yeah, you see it through Queen Matilda and Empress Matilda. Queen Matilda wrote to the Pope about, she was the one instrumental in trying to get their son Eustace crowned during Stephen's lifetime to
mm,
guarantee Eustace's succession. And it was Matilda of Boulogne who was in the forefront of that and dealing with the church leaders.
mm.
Um, Empress Matilda, she was proclaimed Lady of the English by the church. You know,
Yeah,
it was Henry of Blois, King Stephen's own brother, who proclaimed her Lady of the English.
yeah,
And Henry seems to be the one that both the Empress and the Queen courted to get him on side because he was he was a papal legate, he was Bishop of Winchester, and he was the influential churchman in the country. And they both seem to have courted him, tried to get him on side. And it was only when Empress Matilda failed to get crowned that Henry returned to Queen Matilda. And
right.
then the Empress goes and besieges Henry's castle in Winchester. But yeah,
Brilliant.
I mean, even later on, after Henry II becomes king, it's Empress Matilda and along with Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry's wife, who try and keep Henry and Thomas Becket
Mm,
together, friends. You know, when they fall out, it's Matilda, it's the Empress and Eleanor
yeah.
who try and persuade Henry to make amends with Thomas. I mean, it doesn't go well in the end, but it shows how they all value and I think realise how influential the church is and that they have to keep the church on side.
No, 100%. And I think it also shows as well that, again, coming back to that kind of women's history versus men's history, that actually these women behind the scenes were doing so much work trying to build these connections, maintain them, send letters here, organize relationships here, and it's kind of a whole like spider web of things that they had to maintain in courts and in a wider aspect.
And from the moment Stephen claims the throne, Empress Matilda is writing letters to the Pope and sending lawyers to the Pope to explain to him that Stephen's stolen the throne. Stephen, of course, is sending his own letters saying that Hugh Bigot, the Earl of Norfolk, heard Henry I say that he wanted Stephen to be king rather than his daughter. That Henry I would disinherit his daughter on his deathbed defies belief, but because they wanted to, everyone believed it.
No, definitely. And do these with what's also interesting I find about medieval women, especially those of aristocracy, is that they typically retire then to a convent, as we see with Adela of Blois. What happens to these two formidable characters then in their later lives?
Yeah, well, Empress Matilda, she fought on in England until about 1140. I think it was 1148 or 1149. She eventually went back to Normandy. Her brother, Robert of Gloucester, died in 1147. And her son Henry was getting old enough to lead the charge for himself. So she went back to Normandy, and she never came back to England again. She didn't even come to Henry's coronation in 1154. And she did eventually retire to, I think it was the Abbey of Bec, once, but only right at the end. Once she was back in Normandy, she was ruling Normandy in Henry's name when he was King of England. You know, she was acting as regent, so she wasn't one to give up too quickly. Matilda of Flanders, the last couple of years of her life, she was trying to arrange to get Eustace crowned, but she was spending most of her time away from court by that point, and a lot of time she didn't retire to a monastery, but she spent a lot of time as a lay visitor at a couple of convents, you know, just having a bit more peaceful life, leaving Stephen to it most of the time. She was probably already ill and just wanted the quieter life, so she spent more time in convents and at peace.
Oh wow, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and just kind of, I guess, as I asked last year, do you have any other upcoming projects that you're doing?
You asked. You had to ask. I have. Well, Women of the Anarchy comes out in the US in about 6 days' time, I think it is. In June, I have another book out in the UK, Heroines of the Tudor World, which is a sequel to my first book, Heroines of the Medieval World. So I've gone on to the Tudors for a little while. But luckily, I didn't stay there. My next book is out in January, and that's Scotland's Medieval Queens.
Wow.
And I think that's probably my best work yet. I really enjoyed writing it, and there was so much to discover. And I didn't realise, but there are tons of chronicles from Scotland. And it was brilliant to be able to find all these chronicles that actually do mention, they may only mention the Queen rather than a particular Queen, but you can work it out. And there are, you know, you get to see the lives of Scotland's queens, and that was illuminating.
Do you find there's a difference between, I guess, queenship in Scotland compared to, say, England?
There's a lot of differences in the monarchies themselves between Scotland and England. You do have the traditional queenly roles of patronage and intercession. I think because Scotland has such a violent past, you also get queens acting as regents or being pushed out of the way as regents as well sometimes. And the rule in Scotland is once a queen remarries, she can no longer be regent.
Right.
Which is a bit awkward for some of them.
Yeah.
But it was fascinating to just see the different methods of kingship. And it was funny, there was one king, I think it was Alexander III, came to the throne when he was something like 7 years old, something like that. And it was the first time they had to establish a regency. Before that, no Scottish king had come to the throne as a child.
Right.
I think Alexander II was 12 or 14 years old, and they decided he was old enough to rule. Malcolm IV, Malcolm the Maiden, was also about 12 years old, and they decided, oh, he's fine, he's old enough to rule as a man.
Yeah.
Before that, they had this system during the time of Macbeth where the crown didn't pass from father to son. It passed from somebody to somebody within the wider family, which guaranteed that you always had an adult king. So the reason they didn't know what to do with the regency was they'd never had one. They'd never had a reason to have one. And it was like, it's interesting.
Yeah.
There was also a battle. I can't remember which it was, but it was decided by champions.
Huh. Oh, wow.
Why can't they do that every time in a war?
Yeah.
Just have champions fight, and whoever won, that's the side that won.
Yeah. It would save a lot of lives. It would.
But yeah,
Oh.
Scottish history was fascinating to look into it properly. I mean, I've always been interested in Robert Bruce
Mm.
and his wider family, because there are so many women in the Robert the Bruce story, with Elizabeth de Burgh and his daughter Marjorie Bruce, a sister, and Isabel Macduff, who crowned him. If you watch The Outlaw King, they're not in it.
Oh no.
I think they have about 2 women in it, and it's like God, the one story in history where we know that the women were there and present, and they wrote them out of the not out of history, but out of the film.
Oh God. Ah, well, what can you do? But well, I'm definitely looking forward to those. And once again, thank you so much for coming on. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you about the importance of women in history, which is incredibly important. So thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
No worries. And thank you everyone for watching. And be sure to catch our other episodes, which are coming out every so often when I put them out.